Hey guys, tonight we dive into a surprisingly delicate corner of medieval life, one that most history books skim over with an awkward cough. You're lying still under the covers, and your mind floats gently into dim, candle-lit rooms, creaking wooden bed frames and whispers behind stone walls. Because tonight we're talking about medieval condoms, not the glossy latex pouches you might find in a vending machine today, but their cruder, stranger ancestors. Think animal intestines tied at the base with thread. Think linen soaked in chemicals. Think of a world where secrecy, survival, and social taboo shaped every intimate act. You're about to stroll quietly through boudoirs, where hushed superstition meets desperate practicality, and you probably won't survive the hygiene standards. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the current time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where and when you're listening in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a medieval village somewhere in 14th century Europe. The air is damp with the smell of smoke and dung, and the marketplace is closing for the evening. Candles flicker behind crooked shutters. Most people around you believe that illnesses are caused by imbalances of humors or bad air, but some are starting to whisper about this new thing disease you can get from sex. They don't understand the science yet, but they're suspicious and afraid. That fear is the beginning of something crude and cautious, a centuries-long effort to control what happens between the sheets. Not for pleasure, not for morality, but for survival. You wander past a stone apothecary's shop with a wooden sign hanging loosely by rusted hinges. Inside the shelves are lined with dried herbs, strange jars, and rolled-up parchments. The apothecary, a balding man with crooked fingers, mutters something about dried beaver testicles, powdered mercury, and protective sheaths. You're not entirely sure what he means, but he gives you a wink that makes your stomach turn. Even now, most people still rely on superstition and ritual. You hear a hushed conversation at the back of the shop. Two men speak of traveling soldiers and a new illness, something that causes sores, fevers, even madness. They say it started among mercenaries who came back from Italy. Others whisper it came from the East. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's spreading and it scares everyone. And so begins the strange evolution of the medieval condom. You find yourself watching a tanner at work, behind the apothecary, stretching something sinewy over a wooden frame. Pig intestines. He's not making sausage. He's preparing what some men call armor for the serpent, dried and rubbed with oil tied with a thread at the base. It's not comfortable. It's not reliable. But it's something. Still, most common folk can't afford it. They don't even know it exists. You wander into a peasant's hut, where children sleep in corners and a couple huddles for warmth under straw. Their methods are much older, timing withdrawal prayers, herbal brews, but no barriers, no sheaths. The idea of wrapping something around the male body part before sex. That's a concept still foreign, reserved for the wealthy, the desperate, or the curious. And yet ideas travel through trade, war, and whispers. You hear it again in the back alley of a brothel near the port. A sailor brags about a French physician who recommended linen soaked in wine vinegar, or even salt water, then tied in place with ribbon. His friends laugh, but one of them admits he's tried it after catching a burning itch the last time he visited Florence. It helped, he claims, or at least he didn't get worse. You slip out into the streets again past torchlight and the sound of distant church bells. The church has something to say about all this, of course. Lust, contraception, fornication. It's all tangled together in a web of sin. Most priests condemn the use of any artifice that prevents life, but some turn a blind eye, especially when it comes to noblemen or kings whose mistresses are too many to count and whose reputations must remain clean. The irony isn't lost on you. In a world so preoccupied with souls and salvation, it's strange how much energy goes into avoiding the consequences of pleasure. You head toward the town's bathhouse. In wealthier cities like London or Paris, these are places of heat, steam, and mingling bodies. A Roman legacy still barely surviving. Among the chatter, you catch another rumor a German merchant has commissioned sheaths made of oiled silk. Imported, luxurious, reusable. But you're still years, centuries away from anything close to modern reliability. In this time, condoms aren't contraception. They're medicine. Desperate protection against invisible devils, venereal disease, deformity, sterility, spiritual damnation. And yet the very existence of these crude attempts, intestine pouches, linen wraps, herbal concoctions, says something else too. It says that even in an era ruled by fear and myth, people still tried to protect themselves, tried to control their fate, tried to touch without punishment. You walk back through the mud-caked streets past dogs barking at the moon and drunks slumped beside taverns. A flicker of light catches your eye, an upstairs window barely ajar. Inside, you glimpse a figure by candlelight, wrapping something thin around a carved object, testing the knot. Not so different from you, really. Curious, careful, just trying to get by in a world full of uncertainty. And it's only just beginning. The wind picks up as you leave the village behind. Trees sway gently in the dark, and your path winds toward a nearby monastery, its stone walls rising stoically against the night. It's quiet here, a different world altogether, but that doesn't mean untouched by the topic. Monks are supposed to live in chastity, and most do, but some scrolls in the scriptorium whisper otherwise. You step inside the cool chamber, where a young scribe is bent over parchment by lamplight. He's copying a medical text from Salerno, Italy, an ancient compendium of folk wisdom, Arab medicine, and Latin doctrine all merged into one. The page he's working on is smudged and greasy-stained from years of use. It describes a curious thing, cloth soaked in cedar oil and shaped to fit the member for the purpose of disease prevention. It doesn't say condom. That word hasn't been born yet. But the idea is unmistakable. You sit quietly as the scribe murmurs aloud to himself, translating the Latin in modum saculi, in the manner of a little sack. His brow furrows. He doesn't fully understand what he's writing, but he copies it anyway, preserving the knowledge for someone else. Outside, a bell tolls the late hour. You follow the curve of the monastery garden past herbs like pennyroyal mugwort and silphium plants once believed to have contraceptive properties. Pennyroyal in particular is dangerous, even deadly in the wrong dose. Still, women whisper its name behind closed doors, desperate for control over what happens inside their own bodies. In a time when childbirth is as deadly as the plague risk, feels like the only kind of power they can grasp. You wander farther toward a nearby city where another layer of the story unfolds. In wealthier circles, especially among traveling merchants, you begin to hear of more sophisticated inventions. Italian physicians in cities like Venice are starting to experiment. They don't know about sperm or STIs the way modern science does, but they know symptoms. They've seen the damage, and they're trying to stop it. You overhear a conversation at a tavern table. Two men argue over whether sheaths soaked in wine actually work. One insists he read a medical letter from Padua that claims so. The other scoffs and orders more ale. Neither is entirely wrong. Alcohol has some mild antiseptic properties. But this is hardly reliable science. What matters is that these men are talking about it at all. A quiet revolution is brewing, slow, uneven, and largely hidden from the pages of official history. You pass through alleyways where women hang linens to dry, and you can't help but wonder how many of those were once used not to clean, but to prevent. Linen was the most common material in early European condom experimentation. Thin enough to shape, soft enough not to cause pain, and durable enough to rinse and reuse. Not everyone could afford the animal intestine kind. And that's important, because what a condom meant varied wildly depending on class. Among the elite, especially those traveling between courts and cities, protection became a sign of wealth and cleverness. It wasn't advertised, of course. It was private. Hidden in travel kits, buried in drawers, or slipped discreetly into hands by a physician or a trusted servant. Some men even passed down recipes for sheaths to their sons. An heirloom of sorts, equal parts embarrassment and utility. But among the poor, knowledge moved through midwives, through old women with crooked backs and sharper tongues. It wasn't a formal science. It was storytelling. Hushed warnings, herbal lore, things remembered from generations ago. These women knew the names of plants that might bring on a late period or soothe an infection. They knew how to sew linen pouches and steep them in vinegar. And they knew the cost of getting it wrong. You sit beside one such woman now in a small wooden home that smells of smoke and fennel. She is teaching her daughter-in-law how to stitch a narrow pocket, and you realize what it's for before anyone speaks it aloud. This is family knowledge. This is survival passed from hand to hand, one stitch at a time. You step back into the cold air, and your thoughts drift to the larger forces shaping these practices, war, migration, plague. During the 100 Years' War, soldiers traveled across borders, shared stories, shared diseases. The spread of syphilis, though not yet fully named, forced a new kind of awareness. Mercenaries began carrying protective sheaths with them, sometimes made from fish bladders, sheep gut, or treated leather. These were often stiff, uncomfortable, even painful, but still they were better than nothing. War has always accelerated innovation even in the bedroom. And then there's the plague. Not the Black Death itself, which raged too suddenly and too broadly to be blamed on sex. But afterward, during its slower recurrences, as people grew more desperate to control their bodies and their fates. You find physicians writing vague treatises on contagion, and in the footnotes, shy references to preventative barriers. They don't name them, but they describe them. Back in the present moment, you sit at the edge of a small dock, watching the moon ripple across the water. The port is quiet, but the influence of trade looms large. From Arab lands came silken fabrics and ideas, among them the possibility of wrapping the body in cloth, not just for modesty, but for protection. Some even argue that condom-like devices were used in ancient China and Egypt long before Europe ever imagined such a thing. But in the medieval West, shame made progress slow. Church laws thundered against unnatural acts, and contraception was condemned as interfering with God's will. So even though people experimented secretly, quietly, they didn't write it down. They didn't patent it. They passed it through rumor and whisper, mother to daughter, physician to nobleman, sailor to soldier. You lean back and close your eyes. It's strange to realize how much of human history has been lived in this half-light, between the need for protection and the fear of punishment, between invention and silence, between a thin linen wrap and the hope it might be enough. The morning light creeps over the rooftops of a medieval city, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. You stretch and rise slowly, feeling the ache of another restless night. But your thoughts return immediately to the private lives hidden behind these thick stone walls. Because for every market square and cathedral, you see there are 10 stories whispered in bedrooms, taverns, and back alleys. And tonight's story, strange as it sounds, continues to revolve around that thin, often handmade sheath that history almost forgot. You pass by a cluster of boys kicking a wooden ball in the dirt, and one of them shouts a bawdy joke about the bishop's sausage in a sheep's stomach. The others laugh like they barely understand it. You do. That joke's been around in some form for centuries, crude, immature, but based in reality. In more than a few towns, it's an open secret that some men have taken to using sheep intestines for reasons not fit for confession. You hear it everywhere. Brothels, army camps, even among physicians behind closed doors. And yet no one calls it a condom. That word won't be written for hundreds of years. In this age, it's just something you do, something you use, or something you hide. You wander into a bustling university town, maybe Bologna or Montpellier. Students in long robes are debating in Latin about Galenic medicine, body humors, and the nature of disease. One of them, more daring than the rest, brings up the concept of contagion by touch. He cites Arabic texts translated into Latin from the great libraries of the Islamic Golden Age. One scholar from Baghdad had described a disease transmitted through the act of passion. The students scoff, but then fall quiet. Everyone knows someone who came back from a brothel with a fever that wouldn't break. You slip into the dormitory where these young men live. Under one straw mattress, you find a small, stiff pouch of something wrapped in cloth. Sheep gut, tied at both ends. You wonder how many times it's been reused, and how desperate someone had to be to carry it. Nearby in the town's medical quarter, an older physician with ink-stained hands is drafting a letter in careful Latin. He's experimenting with different linings, linen soaked in vinegar, goose fat, and even crushed garlic. He's not thinking about birth control. He's thinking about disease. The French sickness, he writes, creeps through the flesh and leaves bones to rot. He recommends sheaths made of softened leather, though he knows most men will ignore him. Comfort and pride get in the way, until it's too late. You turn a corner and find yourself in a more opulent part of the city, where velvet drapes line the windows and perfumes hang in the air. Here the game is different. Noblemen are discreetly served by physicians and apothecaries who offer more refined barriers. Some are made of imported silk, shaped into cones or pouches. They're not common. They're not cheap. But they're clean, soft, and made with an air of sophistication. These are the condoms of the rich, experimental, luxurious, and swathed in layers of secrecy. And yet, even here, fear lingers. In the corner of a noblewoman's chamber tucked beneath her jewelry box, you find a small vial of liquid and a tightly folded piece of cloth. The liquid is a herbal wash, mugwort, and vinegar meant for rinsing before or after intimacy. The cloth, likely a reused linen sheath embroidered faintly with red thread. A woman's touch. A woman's caution. She can't ask her confessor about it. She can't show it to her friends. But she has it all the same. As you leave the chamber, the sounds of the street return, clattering hooves, barking dogs, the occasional cry of a vendor. You pass a bookbinder's shop, and inside you notice a curious manuscript propped open. It's a collection of medical remedies copied from older sources. One passage, barely legible, describes the use of linen wrappings to be placed upon the manhood, before the act followed by instructions on washing and drying for future use. It's written in plain Latin, with no judgment, just practicality. Knowledge surviving on the margins. And that's the pattern you're starting to see. The history of medieval condoms isn't a straight line. It's scattered fragments, some from monks, some from midwives, some from soldiers, and some from anonymous scribes who dared to record what others would burn. You begin to understand why this story is so elusive. It was never officially taught. It was lived, quietly, awkwardly, desperately. You pause beside a traveling merchant's cart, its wares displayed in neat little rows. Among the spices and dried herbs is a small parcel tied with twine. The merchant eyes you and leans in. For protection, he says barely above a whisper. You pretend not to understand. He nods slowly as if you both know the rules. No one talks about it, but everyone needs it. Further down the road, you enter a village where the church's influence runs especially deep. A preacher is delivering a fire and brimstone sermon in the square denouncing sin in all its forms. He warns of eternal damnation for those who spill their seed or interfere with the divine purpose of man and wife. The villagers listen with bowed heads, but you can't help noticing the subtle glances exchanged between some of them. You wonder how many have hidden linen pouches at home. How many take the preacher's words to heart until the night falls and practicality wins. And yet the church isn't a monolith. Not every priest condemns contraception. Some, especially in cities, quietly tolerate its use, especially to avoid the spread of disease. A few even recommend herbal remedies to married couples who already have too many mouths to feed. Morality bends when survival is on the line. You cross a bridge into another part of the city where prostitutes gather under painted signs, their laughter echoing through the night. Some of them carry their own sheaths, bought, borrowed, or handmade. They soak them in vinegar or wine, hang them to dry in hidden corners, reuse them until they split. These women know the risks better than anyone. They also know that no one is coming to protect them, so they protect themselves. And in that dim awareness passed from woman to woman, man to man, across class lines and language barriers, something remarkable is happening. The beginnings of sexual health. Not yet science, not yet widespread, but real. You lean against a stone wall, watching the lanterns sway in the wind. The air smells of sweat smoke and rosemary. You close your eyes, and for just a moment, you imagine the centuries ahead when condoms will be mass-produced, debated on television, sold in bright foil packages, when they'll be symbols of safety jokes in teen movies, points of political debate. But back here, in this fragile, flickering world of medieval Europe, there's still secrets. Wrinkled linen, pig gut, dried, rinsed, and hidden away. And yet they exist. And that's enough to keep the story going. The city fades behind you as you follow a worn dirt path leading toward the countryside, where small villages dot the hills like forgotten fingerprints. The pace here is slower, the conversations more hushed. But even in these quiet corners, the story of the medieval condom takes on its own peculiar shape. You arrive at a village inn, its walls made of timber and wattle, the thatch roof low and uneven. Inside, a fire crackles and sputters, and travelers gather at long tables, drinking heavily after days on the road. Among them is a man with a crooked nose and a deep laugh. He's a peddler, and his bag is full of curiosities, trinkets, spices, charms, and something else. Wrapped in waxed cloth, he reveals a small bundle to a curious customer, a delicate tube yellowed with age and tied with a single horsehair at the end. Sheep gut again, and judging by the man's tone, it's as much a novelty as it is a tool. Stops the French itch, he chuckles. And if it don't, at least it keeps your conscience clean. The others laugh, but some listen more carefully. The disease may be laughed off in daylight, but it terrifies in the dark. You take a seat near the hearth and listen as another man, a soldier with ragged boots, recounts a tale from Flanders. He claims some brothels there now require a sheath for their higher-paying clients. Not for birth control, for business. A sick soldier is bad for the tavern. A dead one even worse. He swears it's true, and others nod. War has taught men a new kind of caution. You step outside later. The stars overhead blinking like distant memories, and your mind wanders to the women who often bore the consequences of this hidden fragile protection, or lack thereof. In a nearby cottage, a midwife prepares a bitter herbal tonic for a young woman with a worried face. The brew is made from rue and juniper, both rumored to have abortifacient effects. The girl drinks slowly, her hands trembling. You can tell this isn't the first time the midwife has done this. She wipes the cup clean, says nothing, and blows out the lamp. In villages like this, where medical knowledge is scarce and the church's reach is long, a condom is not just a barrier, it's a lifeline that doesn't yet exist for most. Still, rumors trickle in from the cities. Linen sheaths, fish bladders, even something called the English riding coat, though no one agrees on what that actually means. The terms are changing. The whispers are multiplying. You see drawings vague and rudimentary, scratched into the corner of a physician's notes, tubular shapes, with annotations in Latin, to be tied at the root, to be cleaned with brine. You head into the woods, where beneath the cover of trees, knowledge moves freely. A woman kneels beside a stream, washing cloth in cold water. She's older, wrapped in layers, her hands red from the chill. You approach quietly, and she gestures to a small wooden box beside her. Inside are hand-cut pieces of linen, thin rolled and stitched on one side. She doesn't smile when you look inside. She just says, for the girls, better to stitch this than bury another. You leave her in the silence, your thoughts heavy with the reality that for centuries, women bore the brunt of a world without reliable control over their own reproduction. The medieval condom, when it did exist, was almost always controlled by men. Access to it was uneven, its use inconsistent, its effectiveness questionable at best, and yet the will to try endured. Your feet carry you toward a small roadside chapel where a friar tends a garden of herbs. He welcomes you with a warm nod and shows you around lavender, comfrey, and yarrow, all neatly labeled on scraps of parchment. As he guides you through the rows, he pauses at the pennyroyal bush. A dangerous plant, he says, but one often asked for by women, though they never say why. He knows. Of course he knows. Back in the chapel's scriptorium, you flip through a collection of medical writings bound in worn leather. Inside, among treatments for gout and instructions for making poultices, is a curious recipe. To preserve the body from certain affliction of Venus, take cloth of flax, soak it in vinegar and salt, and place it upon the member before the act. No drawings, no measurements. Just a quiet note written centuries ago by someone who thought it worth remembering. And so even in places of God, the traces of protection hide in the margins. You return to the road, passing shepherds and tinkers weaving through another nameless hamlet. At a crossroads, a pair of young lovers huddle beneath a tree. You catch only a snippet of their conversation, her voice warning his, trying to reassure. You don't see what he pulls from his coat, but you guess. Maybe a scrap of cloth. Maybe nothing at all. But that moment of pause, of planning, of trying to make sense of something so intimate and so dangerous is as old as time. It's easy to imagine that history is only kings and wars, plagues and revolutions. But tonight, you see the quiet threads that run between it all, stitches in linen knots, tied tight, pouches rinsed and dried by moonlight. A shadow history that never made it into textbooks but shaped lives all the same. The wind picks up again. A wolf howls faintly in the distance, and somewhere nearby, in the glow of a single candle, another pair of hands ties a length of thread around something meant to do more than protect. It's meant to give just a little peace of mind in a world that offers so little of it. The story continues, and you're just getting deeper into the folds. The road beneath your feet turns muddy as you make your way toward a coastal town, one of those places where the ships arrive with spices, rumors, and occasionally scandal. The sea air hits you first, heavy with salt, and the faint sour trace of fish left to dry in nets. You pass dockworkers, their hands, blistered faces, wind-chapped, and overhear a few muttering about a sailor who came back burning at both ends. They laugh, but not comfortably. This town, like many ports, is a place where people know too much and trust too little. Disease moves as quickly as the tide, and the people here, especially those who sell pleasure, companionship, or relief, have learned to adapt. Behind shuttered windows and creaking doors, the practice of barrier protection is gaining quiet traction. It's not common, it's not reliable, but it's something. You slip into a tavern near the wharf, the kind with low ceilings and benches polished smooth by elbows and spilled ale. In one corner, a foreign trader with olive skin and gold earrings unfurls a parcel for a paying customer. Inside is something strange and shiny, thin as onion skin and faintly iridescent. It's made from fish bladder, the trader says, treated with oil and flattened with a hot stone. It's soft, flexible, and light enough to fold into a coin purse. The sailor buying it doesn't ask questions. He just pays and pockets it quickly, eyes darting toward the nearest exit. It's moments like this that you realize there's a market. Not an open one, not yet. But a secret economy where knowledge, need, and desperation intersect. You think about how many hands it took to make that fish bladder sheath. The fisherman who gutted the catch. The woman who cleaned and stretched the membrane. The trader who packed it in salt and carried it for weeks. All so one man might avoid a fever that blisters his skin and poisons his blood. As you leave the tavern, you notice a brothel down the alley. No signage, just a red ribbon pinned to the doorframe. Inside, you speak with a woman named Beatrix, sharp-eyed and stern, who manages the house. She doesn't flinch when you ask about protection. She's seen what happens when men return sick and women suffer the fallout. She started keeping a small chest under her bed with sheaths cut from sheep intestine and soaked in vinegar. She shows you one not proudly, but matter-of-factly. It's crude, shriveled when dry, the thread at the end fraying slightly. But she insists they work well enough when oiled and tied right. She even adds lavender oil sometimes for scent, she says, and to calm nerves. Her girls aren't forced to use them, but the option is there. It's better than herbs, better than fear. And then she tells you something that sticks with you long after you leave. The men don't mind it. Not really. It's just the idea that bothers them. They want to forget consequences, but we never can. Her words echo as you step back into the fog. Further inland, you visit a small university where medical students dissect bodies and argue over ancient texts. In one dim room lined with jars of preserved specimens, a young scholar is sketching. His notebook contains drawings of the male anatomy and curious diagrams labeled vulnus gallicus, the French disease. He has read of sheaths made from animal intestines, soaked in lye and dried like parchment. Some texts even suggest reusability if cleaned thoroughly in alcohol or brine. He thinks the idea has merit. His mentor scoffs, dismissing it as barbaric surgery for peasants. You move on thinking about that divide again between the curious and the cautious. Between those who could afford to experiment and those who had no choice but to risk everything. You remember the village women stitching linen in silence, the noblemen carrying silk sleeves, the sailors folding fish bladders. There is no uniformity, just scattered attempts, scattered hope. You reach the countryside where a traveling monk is resting beneath a tree. He invites you to sit and eat from his bundle of bread and dried apples. His robes are threadbare and his voice gentle. He tells you of his journeys through England, France, the Low Countries, and how even among the faithful these topics arise. He's heard confessions from men racked with guilt over sheaths used in desperation, from women who plead for forgiveness after drinking teas meant to undo what should have never begun. And then quietly, he adds that not all sin is equal. That intent matters, that survival has a grace of its own. He doesn't judge. He merely listens. And in his tone you hear the echo of many others who have come to terms with their own compromises. You fall asleep that night, beneath an open sky, the stars spread like forgotten names across the darkness. You dream of a medieval apothecary, one who brews a solution of vinegar and myrrh, cuts linen into narrow strips, and gives them away with no questions asked. You watch as a young woman takes one, hides it in her apron, and walks away without ever looking back. When you wake, the fire has gone out, but the embers still glow faintly. The medieval condom was never a revolution. It was never clean, perfect, or guaranteed. It was a whisper passed between survivors, a token of care in a careless world. And tonight, as the wind picks up once more and the clouds roll in from the sea, you realize you're following the path of thousands before you, those who stitched, tied, soaked, folded, and dared to hope that a little sheath of gut cloth or fish skin might make all the difference. And for some it did. The next village you reach is nestled deep in a valley almost forgotten by time. Smoke curls from stone chimneys and chickens peck lazily at the frost-bitten ground. It's quiet here, even stiller than usual. People speak in low voices and step carefully on the frozen earth. You wander past a cottage where an elderly healer tends to a sick child, her hands gentle, her murmurs barely audible. But when the door shuts behind you, the quiet of the countryside folds back over everything, like a thick woolen cloak. And still even here, the history of the condom lingers not in open practice, but in fragments of memory, superstition, and makeshift invention. You enter a barn where an old man is skinning sheep. The smell of lanolin and blood fills your nose. He works methodically, stripping the intestines, washing them in freezing water, and laying them out to dry. When you ask what they're for, he says casings. But the way he says it, short, knowing a little tired, tells you he's aware of the double meaning. You don't push. He doesn't offer more. Further down the hill, in the cramped quarters of a widow's home, you come across a small wooden drawer. Inside are pieces of cloth carefully folded, some of them stained with astringent herbs. There's a pattern to them, tight stitching along one side, a loop at the end. These aren't rags. They're early attempts at a kind of homemade sheath, too narrow for wrapping a wound, too precisely folded to be anything else. The widow doesn't deny it. She just says, better to be careful, even if the church says not to be. She offers you warm broth and doesn't ask your name. You sip in silence, thinking about the generations of women like her, those who never wrote their stories down, never made headlines, never had a voice in the halls of medicine or the pews of power. But they knew. They knew about timing, about risk, about the unbearable cost of a single mistake. And so they made their own answers. You cross into a nearby town with cobbled roads and a small marketplace. Here, tucked between stalls of root vegetables and salted fish, you find a vendor selling cloth bundles. Most are for obvious things, bandages, napkins, baby swaddles. But one bundle catches your eye. It's thinner, narrower, and lightly soaked in vinegar. The merchant doesn't advertise it. But if you linger long enough, he raises an eyebrow and nods toward a back room. There, for a few copper coins, he'll hand you a satchel with 2 small linen tubes tied at one end with string. Wash them good, he warns. Let 'em dry in sun, not shadow. He speaks like a man who has learned through trial and error. No academic degrees, no Latin phrases, just survival passed hand to hand like an heirloom nobody names. And while most historians might skip past that merchant in favor of kings and treaties, you know better now. You make your way to a local bathhouse, one of the few still in use after centuries of church disapproval and plague paranoia. The air is thick with steam and sweat, the walls dark with condensation. Here conversation flows freely. Men complain of aches, gossip about town affairs, and in lower tones whisper about women brothels and ways to avoid the burning kiss. One man, round-bellied and red-nosed, boasts of a physician in Avignon who sold him a French glove, a thin sheep's membrane rubbed with vinegar and tree oil. He claims he used it 10 times before it tore. Another laughs and says he just drinks wormwood every week and takes his chances. No one seems to know which method is better. But all agree on one thing: the itch, the rash, the weeping sores, they're not worth the gamble. And so even the bravest bluffers hedge their bets with whatever odd solution they can afford. Later, outside the bathhouse, you pause by a weaver's shop where a woman is threading flax. She tells you offhandedly that she once made the sheath for a traveling noble. She won't say who, but her pride is evident. He said it was softer than the gut kind. Less stink. She chuckles. But I told him don't trust it more than twice. Her weaving continues, each motion practiced purposeful. You realize she's not the first artisan to make something the world pretended didn't exist. And somewhere beneath the noise of carts and clattering hooves, another sound hums faintly, a growing web of knowledge. Not formal, not documented, but real. Carried by those who stitched, boiled, wrapped, and rinsed. A slow evolution, a quiet defiance. Because while the official world turned its gaze to wars and cathedrals behind closed doors, people stitched condoms. They traded stories. They experimented. They worried. And they hoped. Not for pleasure always, but for safety. For dignity. For the right to choose when and how they bore the weight of consequences. You walk to the edge of town as dusk falls, where the fields stretch into mist, and the air smells faintly of peat and pine. A young couple sits close together beneath a tree, speaking in low voices. She reaches into a cloth bundle and passes him something small. He holds it unsure. She shows him how it works, not with shame, but with quiet confidence. You turn away, giving them privacy. But you smile because in that simple exchange you see everything: the courage to act, the will to protect, the centuries of improvisation that led to this moment. A linen wrap, a thread, a whisper passed between hands. The story isn't over. It's just changing form. You wake to the sound of birdsong drifting through the trees, the kind of quiet morning where time feels slower, and your mind still sways with fragments of the past night's thoughts. You're not in a castle nor a city, just somewhere in between. The road ahead winds through gentle hills, dotted with thatched cottages and crooked fences, and though the land looks peaceful, you know that behind every shuttered window lie secrets. Tonight you're listening to the ones people never wrote down. As you walk, you think back to the university halls you passed through, before young men debating, drawing, theorizing. But here in these rural pockets, knowledge passes differently. not through scrolls or lectures, but through quiet rituals. You reach a small farming hamlet, where a healer lives on the edge of the village. They call her Magda. Her eyes are sharp and her fingers stained with years of herb and blood and smoke. She doesn't welcome strangers, but she lets you watch as she grinds together vinegar-dried rose petals and ash from burnt sage. The mixture goes into a ceramic bowl where she soaks thin scraps of linen. When she lifts them out, she rolls them into narrow tubes and hangs them on a wooden rack by the fire. They're drying. They'll be folded and stitched sealed at one end with thread. Magda doesn't call them condoms. She barely calls them anything. But she tells you they keep girls safe. Safer than prayers anyway. She learned the recipe from her mother, and her mother's mother. Passed down like a family secret. Just another item on a long list of ways to protect, to shield, to buy a little more time in a world that gave women so little say. You stay a while watching her move with the steadiness of someone who's seen too much. She doesn't expect gratitude. She expects silence, and perhaps that's why her knowledge still survives. Leaving the village, you pass a group of field hands on break. They joke loudly, tease one another, and swap exaggerated tales of conquests. But when one mentions an itch that doesn't go away, the laughter shifts. Another quietly admits to using the tie-on kind, claiming he got it from a barber surgeon near York. He doesn't explain what it was made of, just that it smelled like wine and stung the first time. No one mocks him. They just nod, and someone mutters, "Better stung than sick." You keep walking, crossing a river where a fisherman is gutting his morning catch. You notice something odd in the pile of refuse beside him, thin, almost translucent membranes that glisten in the sun. You've seen them before. Fish bladders. He catches your glance and shrugs. They use them in the city, he says. Not here, though. Not unless you've got a reason. And that's the thing. No one talks about it openly, but everyone seems to know. A mile down the road, you find a wayside inn where a traveling merchant rests his donkey. He carries pouches of salt ribbons, candles, and under a false bottom in his crate, a bundle of neatly folded gut sheaths. He sells them to nobles, he says, but only the ones who ask without flinching. They don't want children, he explains, or worse. He lets you hold one thin, delicate, and almost weightless. It's been soaked in oil, tied off with waxed thread and wrapped in fine cloth. He says a physician in Bruges makes them, and that the church pretends not to notice as long as no one talks too loudly. You imagine a nobleman in his chamber rolling this over with careful hands, knowing full well it might split at the seam, but still trusting it more than the whims of fate. Later you stop at a small chapel where a priest tends a garden with more herbs than flowers. You ask him gently if he's ever heard of men using linen wraps or gut sheaths to avoid illness. He frowns, not out of judgment, but weariness. Sin finds a way, he murmurs, and so do men. Then he adds, I've blessed worse things than cloth soaked in vinegar. You're starting to realize that while the church may have thundered from pulpits about the sanctity of life and the evils of contraception, the real world didn't always listen. Or at least it interpreted, twisted, found loopholes. Survival often walked ahead of doctrine. You step back into the road as the sky turns gold and the air sharpens with the smell of early autumn. Somewhere nearby, a mother scolds her son for wandering too far. A baby cries. A man chops wood. And in a home you pass, tucked in a drawer or folded beneath a mattress, is another handmade sheath. Maybe it's been used once. Maybe a dozen times. Washed, dried, hidden, protected. They weren't always effective. They weren't always clean. but they were always made with intent, with care, with calculation, with hope. The medieval condom wasn't a symbol of liberation or rebellion. It was a quiet tool in a loud world. Something used not out of defiance, but out of fear, caution, and above all, love for the self, for a partner, for the fragile gift of control, in a time when most choices weren't yours to make. And as you walk on night, falling again over the road, you start to sense the rhythm of it. Thread pulled tight, linen cut, just so, vinegar boiled and cooled, a shape folded by firelight. A rhythm that's echoed across centuries. Hidden, but never gone. The moon is high by the time you reach the outskirts of a larger town, its glow casting soft silver over the cobbled streets and slate rooftops. This place feels different, busier, more connected to the outside world. There's a subtle hum to the night air, a kind of energy that suggests people here know things they don't say. And as you walk beneath the wooden signs of tailors, bakers, and goldsmiths, your path draws you toward one of the least talked about professions, the barber-surgeon. It's easy to forget that in the medieval world, medicine wasn't tidy or specialized. The barber who cut your hair might also lance a boil, extract a tooth, or stitch your wounds. And tucked away in the back of some of these shops beneath the jars of leeches and saws was a different kind of service altogether. You slip into one such shop where the air smells of herbs and iron. The man behind the counter is balding, broad-handed, and busy sharpening a curved knife. When you ask if he sells certain protective articles, he doesn't miss a beat. "Do you mean the gut ones or the cloth?" he says, as though he's talking about boots. He leads you to a small cupboard behind a curtain where he keeps a selection intestine sheaths, each tied off neatly with waxed twine and dusted with powdered alum to keep them dry. Some are new, some have been returned, cleaned, and resold. There's no regulation, no packaging, just trust, or the lack of alternatives. He shows you how they're prepared. The intestines are soaked in a lye solution, scraped thin with a dull knife stretched over a rod, and then dried under tension. Once dry, they're pliable enough to roll, but not for long. If they aren't used quickly, they become brittle. He oils them lightly with goose fat and wraps them in linen before selling. They'll split if you're careless, he warns. But it's better than nothing. Better than rotting from the inside out. You thank him and leave unsure whether to feel impressed or unnerved. He's just another node in the network, an unacknowledged supplier in a chain of hidden health. A few blocks away, the brothel on the edge of town has no sign at all, just a black curtain hung behind a carved wooden door. Inside, everything is dim red drapes, low voices, the clink of coins. The women here are sharp, seasoned. You speak to one Marion who's been in the business for over a decade. She tells you bluntly, "We use whatever we can get. Sometimes gut, sometimes cloth. I've even seen waxed paper once. Didn't work, but men like to think it does." She shows you a small box she keeps under her mattress. Inside are 4 sheaths, 2 linen, 1 gut, and one that looks like animal skin tanned and smoked until it's dark and leathery. She says the linen ones are the most comfortable, but also the weakest. The gut lasts longer, but tears if it dries out. She always re-oils it, always checks it. Because if it fails, it's her body that pays. You step back out into the cool night and make your way to the physician's quarter, where a young doctor is hunched over a desk, writing by candlelight. He's sketching diagrams, anatomical, clinical, speculative. One shows a cross-section of a sheath rolled onto the male body, labeled in Latin, tegumentum ad morbos vitandos, a covering to avoid disease. He's tried several variations, he says, soaked in brine, boiled in wine, even dipped in vinegar mixed with saltpeter. None are perfect, but some reduce symptoms. Some he thinks might even prevent them. He hasn't shared his work widely. The university doesn't support his experiments. The church would frown. But he's lost too many patients, young men with blackened sores, women who waste away in childbirth, their bodies riddled with illness no priest can explain. You listen as he talks, not with excitement, but with grim determination. He isn't trying to make history. He's just trying to stop the bleeding, to prevent one more cough, one more fever, one more grave. As the candle burns low, you step out again into the night, weaving through alleys where children sleep under rags and dogs scavenge from barrels. You pause beside a public fountain where a washerwoman is scrubbing cloth. You notice she sets one piece aside, smaller, tighter stitched, made from fine linen. She doesn't wash it like the others. She soaks it in a bowl of diluted vinegar, then hangs it separately on a line stretched across the alley. She glances at you, then looks away. Even here in the humblest of places, knowledge survives. And now the story begins to feel less like fragments and more like a tapestry stitched together from cities and villages, brothels and bathhouses, churches and bedrooms. There is no single inventor, no dramatic unveiling, just hands. Hands sewing, soaking, drying, tying. Hands passing tools from lover to lover, from mother to daughter, from apothecary to soldier. Hands trembling hands, practiced hands, desperate to control what so often could not be controlled. You end your walk at a city wall, looking out over fields bathed in moonlight. Somewhere out there, someone is preparing another makeshift sheath. Maybe he's a noble, maybe a peasant. Maybe he believes it will save him. Maybe he knows it won't. But he uses it anyway. Because even in the Middle Ages, beneath layers of ignorance and oppression and silence, there was always an ember of agency, a flicker of resistance. A moment before the act where someone said, "I choose not to risk everything tonight." And that choice, however fragile, is the beginning of something profound. Dawn rises over the fields as you leave the city behind the sky, a wash of pink and smoke blue. You feel it in your bones now, this slow, secret journey through medieval time, and how even the most intimate taboo or whispered aspects of human life still shaped the world as much as any sword or sermon. You walk a well-traveled road, now worn smooth by carts and cloaked figures, many of whom once carried tucked-away pouches of sheep gut or linen stitched in silence. Your destination today is a market fair. These were the social engines of the age places, where goods gossip and ideas flowed freely, even if no one wrote those ideas down. The fairgrounds are already filling with voices and color. Merchants from neighboring regions set up their stalls, hawking spices, tinctures, bolts of cloth, and strange mechanical tools. You stroll through, careful not to draw attention, and begin noticing the quiet vendors with no signs, just eyes that watch and weigh who approaches. One of them, a man in a patched green cloak, sells jars of vinegar and bundles of tightly rolled linen. To most, he's just another cloth merchant. But if you linger, ask the right question, maybe mention protection from the itch, he'll nod, once disappear beneath his cart, and return with something more discreet, 2 wraps soaked in vinegar and dried flat, rolled into little tubes and tied with waxed string. He doesn't explain how to use them. If you've come to him, he assumes you already know. He tells you to rinse them before and after, to dry them in the sun, and to replace the thread often. They last 4 or 5 times if you're careful, he mutters. More if you don't move too much. Nearby, a young woman sells medicinal bundles, lavender, rue, pennyroyal. She claims they're for warding off bad dreams, but she says it with a look that dares you to believe her. Her satchel is full of dried plants that every midwife knows aren't just for dreams. You ask if she's heard of linen wraps used as barriers. She smiles softly, doesn't answer, and offers you a small bundle wrapped in red thread. You didn't ask for it, she says. But you'll be glad to have it. Not far from the market, you hear singing church hymns carried by children in procession. Their innocence contrasts with the hushed deals and the hidden exchanges you've just seen. And yet the church still looms over this story. You visit a small chapel just outside the market square where a traveling friar is preaching against the sins of the flesh. He quotes from scripture about fruitfulness, about lust, about eternal judgment. His voice is loud, urgent, almost angry, but many in the crowd fidget eyes lowered, and when the sermon ends you spot a man pull the friar aside. They whisper, then vanish into the back. 10 minutes later, the man emerges clutching something small, something wrapped in a cloth. A contradiction, perhaps. Or perhaps just another version of mercy. You continue walking through the market and come across a foreign merchant from North Africa. His robes deep red, his wares exquisite. He doesn't speak Latin well, but when he hears your question about coverings protection, he gestures excitedly. From a case, he produces a sample, a thin, soft sheath made of goat bladder, cleaned, smoked, and lightly perfumed with myrrh. Arab physician, he says, thumping his chest proudly. Cairo. Very old. Very clever. You ask if he sells many. He shakes his head. Too strange for here, he says. But better. He tells you that in his homeland, these things are not always taboo, that healing and prevention are seen as gifts of Allah, that sometimes practicality is more sacred than silence. You walk away carrying his words with you. As the day fades, you settle in a quiet courtyard and watch the market dissolve into shadows. You think of the people you met, the linen vendors, the herb sellers, the healers, the skeptical priests. All part of the same unspoken movement. Not a rebellion, not quite. Just a quiet, collective will to survive. No one calls these things condoms. There is no standard name, no standard method. What they are is determined by what people have: cloth guts, thread oil, garlic wine. What they are is shaped by what people fear: sickness, pregnancy, sin, abandonment. What they are is defined by hope that this fragile thing might stop something worse from taking hold. And they persist, across class, across region, across gender, despite laws, sermons, taboos, despite the risk, despite the shame. Because need always finds a way. You close your eyes, breathing in the scent of distant fires and fading lavender. Around you, the world is quieting. Merchants pack up their secrets. Lovers find one another behind curtains. And somewhere someone reaches for a wrinkled pouch of sheep gut or a vinegar-soaked wrap and ties it carefully, silently in the dark. A choice made in the quiet, with no one watching, but with centuries behind it. The next leg of your journey takes you north through marshy lands and narrow passes where towns shrink in size and the wilderness presses closer. You follow a caravan trail, once used by spice merchants and silk traders, now mostly empty except for the occasional tinker or wandering bard. But even here, along these overlooked paths, the story continues, tucked into saddlebags, whispered across campfires, and hidden in the folds of travelers' cloaks. You arrive at a roadside inn just as the sky begins to drizzle. Inside, the fire is already burning low, and a few men huddle around mugs of ale boots drying by the hearth. You take a seat near a merchant with a long beard and a stack of ledgers bound with cord. He's the type who's seen half of Europe and half a dozen plagues. When asked if he's come across protective sheaths in his travels, he chuckles. "You mean the gut ties," he says. "Every city calls them something different. But yes, I've used them. I've sold them. Better than the rash. Better than an unwanted mouth." He leans in and describes a batch he once bought in Antwerp soaked in brandy trimmed with waxed linen. Didn't smell great, but worked well enough. He offers no illusions. You don't use them because they're pleasant. You use them because you've seen what happens when you don't. The other men nod. One mutters about a sailor whose body broke out in boils. Another says he once knew a woman who drank vinegar straight for weeks to delay pregnancy. These aren't refined conversations. They're raw, practical. You realize that in places like this, the condom was never moral or immoral. It was simply useful. As you settle into a corner, the innkeeper's wife brings bread and broth. She's older, wiry, her hands calloused. When you ask softly if women here ever use cloth wraps or gut sheaths, she snorts. They don't ask me, but I know. She pulls a small pouch from beneath the counter. Inside are several narrow linen tubes sewn shut at one end and stained faintly from soaking. I make them for girls whose mothers know better. Quietly, carefully. It's not a sin to be safe. You watch as she threads another piece of linen stitching with speed and muscle memory. Some ask for herbs, too, pennyroyal blue cohosh. Dangerous, but sometimes safer than what comes after. She doesn't name names. She doesn't need to. You spend the night in the loft above the stables, the roof leaking slightly. In the darkness, you think of how far this knowledge travels without ever appearing in scrolls or sermons. Through handwork, through shared glances, through a midwife's wink or a mother's quiet warning. The next morning, you follow a winding path to a small hilltop village. It's colder here and the locals are wary of strangers. You hear children singing a rhyme as they skip rope, something about a stinging sickness and vinegar cloth. It's a game to them now, but the fear it came from lingers in the air. In a nearby barn, you meet a tanner boiling intestines for sausage casing. His brusque hands always moving. But when pressed, he admits he's sold cleaned gut tubes for other uses. He doesn't care why people want them. He just knows to salt them, dry them flat, and rub them with oil. He doesn't advertise. It's all word of mouth. You sell one, he says, and 5 more show up by week's end. Back in town, you visit a small school where a teacher is reading from a book of morality tales. One includes a parable about a man punished for attempting to obstruct life. It's vague, allegorical, but the children squirm. Even they seem to understand the weight of what's left unsaid. After the lesson, the teacher, an aging cleric, sits with you in the garden. You ask if he's ever heard of barriers used to prevent disease. He hesitates, then sighs. We're told to condemn them, he admits. But when I hear confessions, I don't speak of hell. I speak of hardship, of carelessness, of pain. And if someone uses cloth or gut or thread to avoid more suffering, he trails off. I don't condemn it. You nod, and the silence between you speaks volumes. As evening falls, the townsfolk gather for a harvest feast. There's laughter, music, roasted meats, and mugs of honeyed ale. You sit near a young couple holding hands under the table, their eyes bright with shared secrets. You catch a glimpse of a small pouch in the man's cloak, a tied bundle waxed at the seams. The woman notices you looking. She offers a small smile, not embarrassed, but proud. And just like that, you realize something important. This story isn't just about fear. It's about effort, about care, about the many forms that love can take in a world full of risk. It's about men who take precautions, not just for themselves, but for their partners. It's about women who demand control even when society offers them none. It's about people who, without science, still understood what mattered: protection, preparation, a bit of peace in the face of uncertainty, and all through a sliver of cloth, a twist of gut, A stitch, a soak, a knot. As you lie beneath the stars that night wrapped in your cloak and listening to the distant crackle of fires, you picture all the unknown hands that made the same preparations. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for life to continue just a little safer, and for once that feels like more than enough. By the time you reach the next village, the leaves have started to fall in amber curls, crunching underfoot with every step. There's a crispness in the air, a sign that winter's drawing close, and with it a deeper urgency in the daily routines of the people you pass. The harvest is nearly over, and minds are turning inward toward warmth, toward survival, and for some toward the more private matters of the body. This village is modest but proud. There's a small church, a blacksmith, a windmill that creaks with every gust, and a healer's hut just off the main path. You approach the hut just as an older woman wrapped in thick wool steps outside carrying a bundle of dried herbs. She sees you, assesses you with a glance, and nods you in. Inside, the smell of rosemary vinegar and soot fills the space. Her name is Tilda, and she's been helping the women of this village for more than 30 years. When asked about protective cloths, she doesn't bat an eye. Linen if you're lucky, old wool if you're not, she says, sorting the bundle into jars. Soak it in vinegar. Rub it with alum or rue. Not perfect, but better than another mouth in a bad year. She leads you to a low shelf near the hearth, where a wooden box holds several narrow cloth tubes. Some are fresh. Some are used and drying by the fire. She shows you how to roll them tightly, how to fasten the knot with a loop of thread, and how to wash them with lye soap. She's not a physician. She's not a midwife. She's just someone who knows what happens when people are left to figure things out alone. Her voice lowers as she adds, "The priest preaches abstinence, but he's never carried a child through winter. Never buried a girl bled white from a fever. I help where I can. As you leave her hut, the weight of her words clings to you. Back on the main road, you pass a cluster of older boys clustered near a well. Their laughter stops when a younger one asks what it means when a girl asks for the cloth. They don't answer. One looks away. Another spits. You can tell they've heard the phrase, but they haven't earned the wisdom yet. You continue toward a neighboring village where a rare thing awaits a printer. The printing press is still new, clunky, and slow, but it has already begun changing everything. Most printed books are Bibles, sermons, and herbals, but in backrooms and private collections, other material is starting to circulate, manuscripts once copied by hand, now passed from reader to reader with quiet fascination. You meet the printer in his workshop, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes. When you ask about medical texts, he disappears into the back and returns with a slim sheaf of pages, anonymous, unbound. It's a translation of an older Italian document with diagrams of reproductive organs, drawings of cloth wraps soaked in antiseptics, and notes about diseases transmitted in heat and lust. One page includes a rough illustration of a sheath marked with arrows, showing how to tie and secure it before use. The language is stiff and clinical. The drawings are crude, but the intention is clear. The printer doesn't sell this copy. He shares it as if it's part of a quiet resistance. These are truths we all live by, he says, whether the bishops like it or not. Further down the road, you arrive at a manor house, stone walls, trimmed gardens, and guards at the gate. You'd think nobility wouldn't bother with common tools like linen wraps, but you'd be wrong. Inside, you're granted a short conversation with the steward who handles the estate's medical supplies. He confirms that his lord, like many nobles, keeps a set of hygienic sheaths commissioned from an apothecary in the capital. They're made of treated gut, rinsed in spiced wine, and stored in oiled cloth. They aren't just functional, they're status symbols. To avoid scandal, the steward explains, and inconvenience. But it's not just about discretion. The noble's mistress, too, keeps her own supplies. A pouch of barrier cloths she requested from a merchant during a summer trip to Bruges. She doesn't rely on his protection. She provides her own. It's an act of quiet power tucked into silk drawers beneath layers of velvet and lace. As you leave the manor, you glance back at the window where a candle flickers behind drawn curtains. Somewhere inside, another act of caution, or love, or self-preservation, unfolds silent and unseen, but deeply felt. Night comes quickly, and you settle beneath a leaning oak tree. As you stare up through the canopy, the stars peek through like slits in the sky. You think of the countless hands that have worked in private away from parchment and politics to make the world just a little more survivable. Not better. Not perfect. Just safer, one thin barrier at a time. The medieval condom never belonged to one class, one culture, or one name. It passed through so many hands that its origin blurred into myth, its identity shifting from cloth to gut, to leather, to lore. It was dismissed, forbidden, hidden, reused, blessed, burned, and reinvented. But it was never absent. Even in a world ruled by men, faith, war, and silence, people still found ways to protect themselves and each other. With vinegar, with thread, with will. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. The days grow shorter as you continue your journey eastward, frost beginning to glaze the tips of the grass, smoke curling earlier from chimney tops. Winter presses close, and with it comes a new kind of urgency, the type that drives people indoors and magnifies the small, intimate decisions that shape their lives. As the world hardens around them, their choices behind closed doors become even more tender, more calculated, and sometimes more desperate. You arrive at a small town known for its textiles, spinning wheels hum like insects behind shuttered windows, and wool hangs in great loops from the rafters. This is a place where hands never stop moving. You stop at a cloth merchant's stall, where bolts of finely woven linen are stacked in neat piles. The merchant, a tall woman with bright eyes and weather-worn skin, offers you a square of bleached fabric before leaning closer. You're not just looking for cloth, are you? You say nothing, but she nods all the same. She leads you into the back where offcuts and scraps are bundled into specific, almost surgical lengths, narrow rectangles, pre-softened and trimmed. The sailors buy them, she says. Some stitch them themselves, some don't bother. The smarter ones soak them first. I sell the vinegar too. Peppermint oil if they can afford it. She doesn't speak with shame or even secrecy, just a businesswoman filling a need. Her linen is finer than most, soft enough to prevent chafing, strong enough to resist tearing. I tell them, she adds, they still need to be gentle. The cloth doesn't do all the work. It's just there to buy them a chance. And that really is all these early condoms ever were, a chance. Not certainty, not security, just one small layer between survival and surrender. You step back into the cold and follow the trail toward a monastery on the hill. The monks here are known for their herb garden, and though their vows of silence keep them from idle chatter, their hands speak volumes. You're invited into their infirmary, where a bearded brother grinds dried nettles into powder. Nearby, a manuscript lies open, its margins filled with handwritten notes in careful Latin. You can't help but notice a passage in the middle of the page, an entry labeled De Preventione Morborum Carnalium, on the prevention of carnal diseases. It describes a method involving a sheath of cloth soaked in red wine and ash from burnt rosemary, dried under the sun, and used to wrap the instrumentum virile before intercourse. The instructions are vague, but the intent is clear. The monk doesn't explain. He only turns the page. But the message has already been passed. Down in the village near the monastery, you hear the same old tensions rumbling through the town square. A younger priest condemns barriers of the flesh, warning they interfere with God's plan. But an older deacon gently counters, reminding the crowd that prudence is a virtue too. They argue quietly behind closed chapel doors, doctrine against practicality, sin against suffering. And meanwhile, the midwives keep working. In a small cottage by the river, you meet a mother of 6 who is now at 40 helping others avoid the fate she never escaped. She shows you her supplies, cloth sheaths already sewn and soaked stored in a waxed box beside her bed. She gives them freely without judgment. "I'm tired of digging little graves," she says. "Better they risk the wrath of heaven than another winter without food." You feel the cold creep into your boots as you leave her home, and it dawns on you again how much of this story is about women. Not officially, not in records, but in truth. They were the ones who bore the children, buried the stillborn, risked their lives every time they said yes. And while the men might have bought the sheaths, the women were the ones who remembered when they failed, who learned what to mix, who knew which cloth worked better, who stitched not just to protect, but to reclaim. You pass a soldier on the road who tells you casually that his commander back in Milan issues gut sheaths to his men before campaigns. Keeps the ranks clean, he says. Less itch, fewer slow marches. Everyone wins. He laughs, but you can tell it's half bravado. He knows what happens without them. Further down the trail, you come to a manor where a foreign physician has taken up residence. He's eccentric, brilliant, and viewed with suspicion by the church. But the nobility adore him because he treats what others pretend doesn't exist. He shows you a set of sheaths he's developed, fish bladder, soaked in vinegar and stitched at the base with silk thread. He's even experimenting with waxed paper, though it tends to crack. His notes are dense, written in Italian, Arabic, and Latin. He doesn't just want protection. He wants refinement, repeatability, proof. And while he speaks in lofty terms, disease vectors, tissue, permeability, material, fatigue, you realize he's still part of the same movement that began with a single stitch in the dark. Just better tools, better ink. As night falls once again, you pause on a hilltop, watching candlelights flicker in the homes below. Somewhere someone is reaching for their wrap, tying it off, hoping it holds. Somewhere else, a woman is boiling linen in a pot laced with mint. A monk is copying a recipe. A merchant is stitching cloth beside his fire. A mother is teaching her daughter the quiet steps to survival. It's not romantic. It's not glamorous. But it's real. And as the stars return overhead, you know that these fragile, forgotten pieces of cloth and gut and oil shape the lives of thousands who never made it into the chronicles. Their legacy isn't in monuments or epic poems. It's in the simple act of care sewn tight against the tide of uncertainty. And the thread somehow holds. The air has turned sharper now, each breath like a sip of iron. You're wrapped tighter in your cloak boots, heavier with the damp of early frost, and yet the path calls you on. Tonight, you're tracing the final threads of this strange, nearly invisible story, the one spun not from legend or battlefield glory, but from fabric secrecy and the unyielding will to protect what matters most in a world that seldom makes protection easy. You come to a crossroads tavern, the kind that welcomes everyone and belongs to no one. Inside, the fire crackles and spits, and the scent of roast turnip mixes with pipe smoke. Travelers sit shoulder to shoulder, traders, mercenaries, minstrels, and more than a few who've seen the underside of society's boots. These are the people who carry stories from one town to the next, truth and rumor bundled together in every ale-slicked tale. You take a seat beside a caravan driver, a woman with leathery hands and a scar running across one cheek. She tells you unprompted about a brothel outside Krakow, where every visitor is required to use a linen sheath. The madam provides them washed and dried on racks behind the kitchen. They call it the House of Clean Love, she laughs. Funny name, but smart. No one wants the burn. She goes on to describe the variety cloth intestine, even wax-dipped parchment once, though that one cracked like ice. She shrugs. You learn what works by what doesn't. At the far end of the tavern, a traveling bard tunes his lute and sings a song with lyrics you've never heard before, part satire, part lament. The verses reference goat gut armor, love's vinegar kiss, and silken caps from distant shores. The audience chuckles, some nod knowingly, others pretend not to understand. But the language of protection has seeped into culture, even song, even jokes. You step out again as the moon rises high, and for the first time you start thinking not just of how these rudimentary condoms were used, but what they meant. They meant dignity in a time when shame ruled the body. They meant choice when options were few. They meant power in whispered form, especially for the powerless. As you walk toward the next village, you pass a small convent tucked behind stone walls. Surprisingly, the nun who answers your knock is willing to speak. Her voice is low, calm, unbothered by the subject. We've treated women who came to us sick, she says. Too many times. They speak of cloth, of herbs, of fear. She doesn't pass judgment, just listens, offers chamomile tea. And in her quiet tone you hear an unspoken truth. Not all forms of compassion wear cassocks. Further along the path, you meet a foreign scholar traveling from the Byzantine Empire, carrying manuscripts wrapped in waxed leather. He tells you in Greek, which you strain to follow, that writings in Constantinople long ago described protective sheaths made from lamb caul, soaked in wine, blessed with incense. They were not condemned, he explains, just forgotten. Like many things that make men uncomfortable. You stay that night in a shepherd's cottage sharing a simple meal of barley stew. The shepherd's wife asks you if people in other villages still make the tie, as she calls it. You tell her yes. Her shoulders soften. Good, she says. Girls should know. She reaches for her sewing kit, and by lantern light shows you her method. Cut the cloth long, fold tight, stitch only halfway. Leave room at the end for tying. She's made dozens in her time. Some she gave away. Some never came back. But when they worked, she says they spared people. In the morning, frost glitters across the field, and the road is hushed beneath the stillness of late autumn. You begin to feel the closeness of endings, not just of this journey, but of a whole way of thinking. Because soon the Renaissance will come. So will microscopes, mercury treatments, rubber manufacturing, the Enlightenment, the condom as we know it. But here in these medieval margins, you've seen something quieter. A long chain of humans improvising under pressure. Not always correctly, not always safely, but always trying. Stitch by stitch, knot by knot. And the most extraordinary thing, they never stopped. From the fish bladders in shipping crates to the linen wraps sewn by candlelight, from the gut sheaths dried beside a brothel hearth, to the cloths tucked into noblewomen's drawers, every item told the same story. You might not control your world, but you can control one small, soft layer between you and the dark. And so they did. 1,000 years of people who understood long before science gave them language that prevention was power. That protection was not a shameful secret. It was an act of love. As the road bends toward your next stop, you pause on a bridge and look down at the water, dark and still, reflecting the last rays of day. Somewhere out there, a girl is being told how to fold the cloth. A boy is fumbling with a piece of twine. A midwife is boiling linen in a copper pot. And another voice like yours is telling this story all over again. Because some threads are too important to cut. You're deep into winter country now. The trees are bare, the river's slow beneath a thin crust of ice, and the sky hangs low and colorless. The world feels quiet in a new way, like it's holding its breath. And yet even in this stillness, you know the story you're tracing hasn't gone dormant. It moves on just beneath the surface, just behind the shutters of fire-warmed homes. Tonight the road leads to a village buried in snowdrifts, where the streets are carved into the white like veins. Smoke curls from every rooftop. Life here is hard but steady. The villagers don't say much, but they know how to endure, and they know how to remember, especially the kind of knowledge that doesn't get written down. You're welcomed into a cottage where a family gathers around a single hearth. The grandmother, gray-haired, thick-fingered, sits with a basket of mending on her lap. You watch as she repairs socks, hems, tunics, then without pause pulls out a narrow strip of linen. She folds it lengthwise, stitches the edge closed, turns it inside out with practiced ease, then knots the end with a loop of dark thread. Her daughter glances over. No words pass between them. Just a glance and a nod. The old woman tucks the cloth away. You realize then that this knowledge isn't just passed from one person to another. It's absorbed. By watching. By living. By being close enough to see and far enough to keep silent. There's no pamphlet. No ceremony. Just small gestures repeated so often they become muscle memory. Later in a barn-turned-stable, a group of young men warm their hands beside the animals. They talk about hunting, about a neighbor's stolen hen, and eventually, inevitably, about women. One boasts about a visit to a brothel in a nearby town, where they make you wear the wrap or pay double. Another pulls a flask from his coat and says he uses cloth soaked in spirits. Burns, he says, but better than rot. They laugh, but there's edge to it. Everyone knows someone who's had the rot. They don't say the word syphilis because that word hasn't taken full hold yet. But they know the signs, sores, fevers, madness. It haunts their laughter like frost on breath. You walk through the village's stone chapel, next small and crumbling, where icicles hang from the eaves like fangs. Inside, a young priest is stoking a brazier. He speaks softly, as though afraid the walls might repeat his words. We're taught to condemn these preventatives, he says, but we also bury the ones who suffer without them. He tells you of confessions whispered in shame of girls too young and boys too sick, of herbal drinks that fail and prayers that go unanswered. And though he never says he condones it, his eyes tell you everything. He has seen what happens when people have no choice, and he has seen the quiet ways they build choices out of scraps and cloth. Outside, the snow has begun to fall again, and you head toward a mid-sized town tucked against the mountains. Here, tucked between the tanneries and bakeries, you find something rare, a small handwritten ledger from a physician dated just 2 decades prior. Its worn edges flaking, but in the margins are notes, notations, besides sketches of animal gut, cloth wrappers, vinegar soaks. One section even includes a basic formula: cloth plus wine plus myrrh plus tying thread. Leave to dry near warmth. Do not reuse more than 5 times. There's no indication of where he learned this. No source cited. Just the quiet confidence of someone who knows it works well enough to be worth preserving. And that's what these pages are: preservation, not of science, but of lived truth, of what was used and why and by whom. Later in a tailor's workshop, you speak with a man who makes gloves and undergarments for traveling merchants. He keeps scraps of linen too narrow for clothing. He gives them to a woman across the street who does what needs doing with them. You ask what that means, and he shrugs. She boils them, folds them, sells them to the women who ask for them. He doesn't seem to care what they're used for. He just doesn't like to waste cloth. And in that economy of resource, of wordless exchange, you begin to see the larger picture. There was no central invention, no single eureka moment where the condom arrived. There was only need and ingenuity, and the brave, invisible labor of thousands of ordinary people who dared to interfere with fate using vinegar thread and heat. They did so in secret, behind chapel walls and beneath straw roofs, in brothels, in barns, in monasteries, in noble chambers, in marketplaces, and under oath. They did it while the law looked away, while the church scolded, while physicians debated, while nature kept on risking lives with every kiss. And still they stitched. Even as the frost thickens and the nights stretch long, you know that somewhere, even now, a young woman is folding linen in firelight. A midwife is explaining how to tie the end. A man is pouring vinegar into a jar beside a bed. A merchant is sealing a gut sheath with waxed twine. A cleric is looking the other way. And in all of that, the thread carries on, connecting hands, hearts, and centuries. A quiet revolution woven one stitch at a time. The road is frozen solid beneath your feet now, its surface slick with ice and old cart ruts. The trees are bare bones clawing at a sky gone pale and heavy. Everything feels suspended, like time itself is holding still. And yet the story continues, one final turn, one final stitch, in the long invisible tapestry of how medieval people faced desire, danger, and the desperate need to protect. You find yourself in a coastal town, the kind that's always been half land, half sea, where ships moan in their moorings and gulls scream above frozen fish carts. Sailors here move differently. They know what it is to gamble, to lose, to patch up and keep going. And they perhaps more than anyone have carried the story of medieval condoms across borders and centuries. At a sailor's tavern near the docks, you listen to tales of what men carry in their sea chests: dried herbs, polished stones, coins sewn into tunics, and yes, gut sheaths folded in oiled parchment. Some have been passed around more than they should. One man brags he's used the same one in 5 ports. Another shakes his head and describes one that split mid-act, followed by a month of agony. The lesson is clear. Reuse at your own peril. You speak to a woman who runs the upstairs rooms. She keeps a box of her own beneath her bed. Inside are a dozen sheaths, some cloth, some gut washed, dried, and tied with colored threads to mark them as hers. I don't trust what they bring, she says, adjusting a candle. I trust what I've made. That idea of ownership, of control, feels like a full circle. Because though the story started in hushed whispers and awkward stumblings by now, you've seen that knowledge has settled in. It's not new anymore. It's understood, refined, passed on, improved upon. Still inconsistent, still fragile, but evolving. And now finally you're in the capital. This city is layered with noise and snow, with soot and tension. In one part, the university, in another, the cathedral, and between them, a street of apothecaries and printers, each hawking cures and truths and questions in equal measure. You stop at a small print shop where a thin man with ink-stained cuffs shows you his newest import, a pamphlet from Italy translated into Latin. It bears no title on the cover, only the mark of a circle wrapped in thread. Inside are diagrams crude but clear of sheaths made of cloth, of intestine, of fish membrane. The text offers instructions for cleaning, tips for tying, and even a brief reference to prevention of morbus gallicus, the French disease. There's no author, no attribution, just a quiet assertion. This helps. This might save you. The printer sells it discreetly. Doctors buy it. So do women. I've even seen a friar take one, though he pretended it was for a friend. You find a copy tucked into the cloak of a merchant in the square. Another folded into the satchel of a midwife waiting near the cathedral gates. And at night, as you settle in a guest house by the fire, you see a young couple reading it together by candlelight. They trace the steps with their fingers. They whisper. They prepare. No fear. No shame. Just readiness. You step back out once more, wind biting your cheeks, and walk along the edge of the frozen river that slices through the city. Below the surface, currents still move. And above it, life goes on, families, healers, lovers, skeptics, all living in the afterglow of a 1,000-year journey. Because by now, the medieval condom isn't just a tool, it's a symbol of agency, of resilience, of quiet rebellion against helplessness, a sliver of control in a world ruled by chaos. It was never perfect. It never could be. But it was possible. And that possibility, the idea that something as small could make a difference, is what turned scraps of linen into lifelines, gut into grace, vinegar into hope. And as the snow begins to fall again, soft and slow, you take one last breath of this strange, powerful history and let it settle into your chest. Because the story doesn't end here. It just changes shape. So now as you lie there beneath your covers, your body still, your breath gentle, let your mind drift over the quiet resilience of the past. Forget the loud parts of history, the wars, the kings, the battles. Think instead of a girl folding cloth by firelight, a mother whispering instructions, a man tying a knot in the dark. Think of hands rinsing linen in vinegar of gut, laid out to dry in the sun, of midwives passing secrets like sacred inheritance. No speeches, no proclamations, just survival. Quiet, awkward, improvised survival. That's what history really is sometimes. A patchwork of small, strange choices made in rooms with one candle behind doors that never made it into textbooks. A stitch here, a fold there. A risk taken not for glory, but for love, or caution, or fear, or dignity. And you've walked that path tonight. Not in armor, not with a sword, but with open eyes and a heart full of curiosity. You've wandered through markets, workshops, brothels, monasteries, and homes. You've listened. You've watched. And maybe, just maybe, you've come to understand how even something as mundane as a linen sheath can carry the weight of 1,000 hopes. So now let go of the candlelit streets. Let the whispers fade. Let the thread unspool gently into sleep. You are safe. You are still. You are part of the story now.